She was a Chinese healer, but a white foreman forced her to poison her people. The air in Shan's squalid tent was thick with the smells of hopelessness, deceit, and suppressed grief. Outside the railroad camp groaned under the weight of a deadly sickness, a place where men came to build a new world and instead found their graves. Her hands, skilled in the ancient art of healing, moved with a rhythmic grace, grinding dried leaves into a fine powder. This was not medicine. It was a lie. Each methodical motion was an act of forced composure, her face a calm mask hiding a soul at war with itself. She was a healer, and she was preparing a poison of false hope for the dying trackmen. Her gaze flickered to a small carved charm hidden in her sleeve, a gift from her little brother. The foreman had him. This terrible charade was the price for the boy's life. The tent flap was thrown open, and the foreman, a true bad egg, stood silhouetted against the dying light. "Is the medicine ready?" he sneered. Shan looked at the worthless dust in her bowl and knew she was about to help him commit murder. The air in Shan Lin's tent was a prison of smells. It did not smell of the clean, sharp scents of ginseng and honeysuckle she kept locked away in her small wooden chest. It smelled of deceit. It smelled of the damp, useless weeds crushed into a fine powder in her mortar, their cloying, earthy scent a mockery of the healing arts she had learned at her grandmother's knee. Outside, the railroad camp groaned a sprawling, muddy wound in the earth, and the rhythmic clang of hammers on steel was the only steady heartbeat in a place consumed by sickness. Her hands, small and deft, moved with a grace that betrayed the ugliness of her task. Grind, scrape, pound. The rhythm was a meditation, a way to build a wall between her actions and the screaming of her soul. She was a healer. Her purpose was to mend, to soothe, to restore balance. This was not medicine. It was a lie. Each turn of the pestle was a betrayal of her ancestors. Each grain of worthless powder was a sin against her own people, the dying trackmen who lay shivering with fever in the surrounding tents. They believed in her. They called her Yisheng Doctor, and she was preparing their final comforting dose of nothing. Her fingers brushed against the small worn wooden cricket hidden in the sleeve of her tunic, a charm her little brother Wei had carved for her. The memory of the foreman's words was a brand on her mind, his voice thick with whiskey and menace. "The boy stays with me, apothecary. You do as you're told, he eats, you get clever, and he doesn't." So she worked. She ground the weeds, she perfected the lie, for Wei. The tent flap was thrown open without ceremony, and the foreman, Mr. Harris, filled the space, blotting out the weak afternoon light. He was a large man, a bad egg, whose presence seemed to suck the very air from the small tent, leaving only the stench of sweat and cheap liquor. "Well?" he sneered, his eyes flicking dismissively over her work. "Is the miracle cure ready for my Chinaman?" Shan Lin did not look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the bowl of green-gray powder, her face a carefully blank mask. To look at him would be to reveal the fury and despair that churned within her. "It is ready," she said, her voice quiet, controlled. He leaned over, peering at the bowl with a piggish, ignorant curiosity. "Looks like dirt. You sure this stuff will work?" She chose her words as carefully as she would choose her herbs. A lie that was also the truth. "It is what you asked for," she replied, her voice even. "It will give them a kind of peace." Harris let out a short, ugly laugh. "Peace is good. It's quiet, less complaining." He snatched the bowl from the table. From his pocket he pulled a single grimy coin and tossed it onto the table, where it spun with a hollow mocking sound. "For your troubles," he said. He paused at the tent flap, turning back to her, his smile a cruel slash in his face. "And remember our arrangement. The boy is doing just fine, as long as you continue to be so helpful." He was gone, leaving behind only the lingering smell of his cruelty and the single insulting coin. Shan Lin stared at the coin, a circle of cold, useless metal. Outside, she heard Harris's booming voice announcing the arrival of the medicine from home. A weak cheer rose from one of the nearby tents. It was the sound of false hope, the sound of men celebrating their own death sentence. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic clang of the railroad hammers suddenly sounding like the driving of nails into 100 coffins. She was a healer, and she had just poisoned her own people. The night was a hollow, breathless thing. The usual sounds of the camp, the coughing, the low groans of men in pain, the murmur of fireside conversations had been replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. It was not the silence of healing. It was the silence of a graveyard. Shan Lin sat on her small stool, the single candle flame dancing in the draught, making the shadows on the canvas walls writhe like troubled spirits. The bowl she had used to mix the lye sat on her small table, washed clean, but she could still see the phantom stain of the green-gray powder. She could still smell the cloying scent of deceit. She had not slept. She had listened. She had listened as the weak cheers for her medicine had faded, replaced by the silence that now pressed in on her from all sides. Each moment of quiet was an accusation. Each gust of wind that rattled the tent flap sounded like a dying man's last breath. She was a prisoner in a cage of her own making, haunted by the ghosts she had helped create. A faint scratching sound at the tent flap made her heart seize. A rat, perhaps, or something worse. Miss Lin. The voice was a raw, terrified whisper so quiet she almost thought she'd imagined it. It was young, and it held no menace. Only fear. She froze her hand, hovering over the heavy pestle on her table, her only weapon. "Go away," she whispered back, her own voice tight. "Please," the voice pleaded, more urgent now. "I have to talk to you. I saw the foreman. I know what he's making you do." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, a terrifying mix of exposure and a bizarre, unwelcome flicker of hope. She rose slowly, pulled back the canvas flap, and a boy no older than 17 with a pale, freckled face and wide, frightened eyes nearly stumbled inside. It was Ethan, the young telegraph operator, a boy from back east who always looked as lost and out of place as she felt. He clutched a crumpled piece of paper in his trembling hand. "I'm sorry." He stammered, his eyes darting around the small tent as if expecting to find judgment in the shadows. "I shouldn't be here. But I couldn't. I couldn't sleep." "What do you want?" Shan Lin asked, her voice cold as shield against the hope she dared not feel. He held out the paper. It was a flimsy copy of a telegraph message. Her eyes scanned the neat, blocky text under the flickering candlelight. "To R. Corbin, Union Pacific, HQ. From Foreman Harris, Camp 11B. Cholera outbreak contained. Expense minimal. Chinese healers' methods. Effective but with high mortality. Regrettable but necessary to avoid costly shutdown and delay." The official words, so clean and detached, described a massacre. Her massacre. "He sent it 3 hours ago," Ethan whispered, his face ashen. "He's done this before. At a camp in Utah last year. I just sent the messages. I typed the words. But you—" His gaze met hers, and she saw in his eyes a reflection of her own crushing guilt. You had to look them in the eye. The shared shame broke the dam of her composure. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "He has my brother." She said the words, a raw, broken whisper. "Wei. He is only 10. He holds him in his cabin. He said if I did not do as I was told." She didn't need to finish. Ethan understood. The horror on his face deepened. This was not just a story of corporate greed. It was a story of monstrous personal cruelty. "We have to do something," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of desperate resolve. "This telegram. It's proof. We can take it to the marshal in Green River. And how do we get to Green River? Shan Lin countered the hopelessness returning. His men are everywhere. And my brother. They were trapped. A healer who had become a poisoner and a messenger who had transmitted a lie. Two cogs in a machine of death now staring at each other in the dark. But in their shared guilt, a tiny, fragile seed of rebellion was planted. "First we get your brother Ethan," said his voice no longer trembling but low and determined. "Then we get the proof out." He looked at her, his expression pleading for her to believe in a plan that did not yet exist. She looked back at him, this strange, frightened boy from another world who had chosen to risk everything to share her burden. Outside, the heavy tread of Foreman Harris's boots crunched on the gravel as he made his nightly rounds, his shadow a fleeting monster against their tent wall. The sound was a stark, brutal reminder of the bars of their cage. Shan Lin took a deep breath, and for the first time since she'd been forced to grind those worthless weeds, she made a choice that was truly her own. She gave a single firm nod. Their conspiracy had begun. The small flickering candle in Shan Lin's tent threw their two shadows large and distorted against the canvas walls. They were no longer a healer and a messenger. They were conspirators, their whispers a fragile thread of rebellion in a world owned by Foreman Harris. Fear was a live thing in the tent, a third presence that sat between them, but it was now overshadowed by a new, more potent force, a desperate, razor-sharp plan. "He drinks every night," Ethan whispered, his voice gaining a measure of confidence as he spoke. He drew a crude map in the dirt floor with his finger. "Here, at the saloon tent, with the other foremen. He keeps one guard, a lazy old man named Peters, watching his cabin. Your brother. He's in the small supply shed behind it. The lock is old and rusted." Shan Lin's mind raced, her knowledge of herbs and elements shifting from healing to a different, more dangerous purpose. A diversion, she said, her voice low and steady. Something to draw the guard away. A fire. A fire! Ethan's eyes widened with alarm. "We could burn the whole camp down. Not a real fire." She corrected, her mind already working. A spectacle. Something with more smoke than flame. Something that creates panic but not true destruction. She looked at the boy before her, his face pale with a shared, terrified purpose. "I will create the smoke. You must get my brother." He swallowed hard, the bob of his Adam's apple visible in the candlelight. He was just a boy who sent messages over a wire. But he looked at the copy of the telegram in his hand, at the proof of the crime he had enabled, and he gave a firm, determined nod. "I'll get him." An hour later, under the thin, cold light of a crescent moon, Shan Lin slipped from her tent. She moved like a shadow, a small bundle clutched in her hand. In it were oily rags stolen from the machine shop, a handful of sulfur from her own dwindling medical supplies, and damp leaves collected from the creek bed, a recipe for chaos. The camp was a landscape of restless sleep and sickness. She could hear the low groans of the dying, the sound a constant agonizing reminder of the poison she had been forced to dispense. It fueled her resolve. She reached her target, a supply tent filled with canvas tarps at the far end of the camp from the foreman's cabin. It was far enough to draw the guard, but close enough for the alarm to spread. With trembling fingers, she set the small pile of rags and leaves at the base of the tent and lit it. The flame caught quickly, and the damp leaves and sulfur began to smolder, releasing a thick, acrid yellow-green smoke that billowed into the night sky. It was a noxious, terrifying sight. She didn't wait to see the result. She melted back into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs, and made her way to a vantage point behind a stack of railroad ties, her eyes fixed on the foreman's cabin across the camp. The first shout came moments later. Fire! Over by the canvas stores, the camp erupted. Men silhouetted by the spreading unnatural glow stumbled from their tents. The guard Peters, who had been dozing in a chair on the foreman's porch, shot to his feet. He hesitated for a moment, looking back at the cabin he was meant to be guarding. Then his curiosity and the herd mentality won. He grabbed a bucket and ran toward the commotion. The path was clear. Shan Lin held her breath, her gaze locked on the small supply shed. Now, Ethan, please, now. As if summoned by her thoughts, a slim figure darted from the darkness behind the main cabin. Ethan. He moved quickly, a wraith in the chaotic, flickering light. He reached the shed, worked at the lock for a few agonizing seconds, and then the door creaked open, and he disappeared inside. The wait was the purest form of torture Shan Lin had ever known. Every second stretched into an eternity. The shouts from the fire grew louder. In her mind she saw 100 terrible possibilities. Ethan caught the door not opening, her brother not being there. Then 2 figures emerged from the shed. One was Ethan. The other was a small, terrified boy with her own eyes. Wei. They slipped around the back of the foreman's cabin and vanished into the deep shadows at the edge of the camp, heading for the cluster of rocks they had agreed upon as a meeting point. Shan Lin allowed herself one single shuddering breath of relief before she too began to move, circling the chaos, her own escape, a silent, desperate prayer. She found them huddled behind a large granite boulder. The moment Wei saw her, he let out a choked sob and ran into her arms. She collapsed to her knees, holding him with a fierce, desperate strength, burying her face in his small shoulder, inhaling the scent of him, the impossible, beautiful reality of him being safe. "You're all right." She whispered into his hair, the words for herself as much as for him. "You're safe now." Ethan stood back, his face pale in the moonlight. "We did it." He breathed a look of stunned disbelief on his face. They had the boy. They had the proof. But as the shouts from the camp began to change, the initial panic of the fire now turning to the angry, confused sounds of a search beginning, Shan Lin knew the truth. They had won a single, desperate battle. But their war for survival, a war against a ruthless foreman in the heart of a hostile wilderness, had only just begun. The railroad camp, a place of torment and fear, was a fading nightmare behind them. But the freedom they had won was a terrifying, hollow thing. The open prairie stretched before them in every direction, a vast, indifferent sea of pale grass under a sky that offered no comfort and no cover. This was not a sanctuary. It was a larger, more dangerous cage, and they were 3 mice scurrying across its floor. By the time the first rays of the sun touched the horizon, they were miles away, but the illusion of a head start was a fragile thing. Wei, his small body racked with exhaustion and the lingering trauma of his captivity, stumbled often. Ethan, the telegraph operator, was a boy bred for indoor work for the delicate dance of brass keys and wires. The harshness of the terrain was already taking its toll on him, his face pale, his breathing labored. It was Shan Lin who became their anchor. The healer, once forced to be a poisoner, reclaimed her true self in the heart of this hostile wilderness. Her shame and fear were still there, a cold stone in her gut, but they were banked now, buried beneath the urgent practical needs of survival. "No, not that water," she commanded softly, stopping Ethan as he knelt by a stagnant-looking pool. "It is dead water. It will sicken you." She led them another half-mile, her eyes scanning the landscape not as a fugitive, but as a student of the earth. She stopped at a patch of unassuming green weeds. "Here," she said, digging at the base of the plants with her bare hands. Cool, clean water seeped from the damp soil beneath. The roots of the spiderwort always seek clean water. Ethan looked at her with a new kind of awe, the respect a student gives a master. "How did you know? My grandmother taught me the language of the land," she said, offering the first cup of precious water to Wei. "It is a language they cannot understand." "They" was the unspoken 4th member of their party. The shadow of Foreman Harris and his men loomed over every step they took. They rested during the brutal heat of midday in the scant shade of a rocky outcropping. While Wei slept, his small hand clutching her sleeve even in his dreams, Shan Lin tended to Ethan's feet, which were already blistered and raw from his unsuitable city shoes. She crushed the leaves of a plantain weed she had found, creating a cool green poultice to soothe the broken skin. Her touch was gentle professional. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his face tight with pain and shame. He looked down at his own useless feet. "I'm slowing us down." "You are the reason we are free," Shan Lin replied, not looking up from her work. "Your courage gave us a chance. Now my knowledge will keep us alive. We each have our part to play." He fell silent, but she could feel the weight of his guilt. He finally pulled the folded oilskin-wrapped paper from his pocket, looking at it as if it were a venomous snake. "I still hear the sound of the key," he said, his voice barely audible. "The clicking. I typed their names, Miss Lin, men I knew, men who shared their meager rice with me. I typed their names into a list of the dead for a man who paid me in silver." "And you kept a copy," she reminded him gently. "You chose to carry the proof. That is the message that matters now." He nodded carefully, tucking the telegram back into his pocket. It was their only weapon, their only hope for a justice that seemed as distant and unreachable as the moon. She let him rest, turning her attention to Wei. He was stirring, his face pinched with a deep, weary sadness. She began to sing to him a quiet, ancient lullaby from her village, a song of gentle streams and blossoming plum trees. Her voice was a fragile thread of beauty in the harsh, silent land, a melody of a world they might never see again. The song was for him, but it was also for herself, a reminder of who she was before all this. A healer, a sister. It was the song that saved them and doomed them. As her voice drifted on the wind, she saw Ethan, who had been keeping watch, suddenly stiffen. His eyes were wide with terror, his gaze fixed on a high ridge a mile to the south. Shan Lin's song died in her throat. She followed his gaze. There, silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky, were 3 riders. They were just specks, but they were unmistakable. They were not moving aimlessly. They were moving with the slow, deliberate, confident purpose of hunters who had found the trail of their prey. Harris. The vast, open prison of the prairie had suddenly become a killing floor. "They've found us," Ethan breathed, scrambling to his feet. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Shan Lin's heart. She grabbed the still drowsy Wei, pulling him up. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The rolling hills offered no cover, no sanctuary. They were exposed, 3 tiny figures against an immense canvas about to be erased. The riders spurred their horses, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The chase was on. The time for quiet desperation was over. The time for running for their lives had just begun. The open prairie was a sun-bleached hell, a vast, empty stage for their desperate, hopeless flight. The 3 riders on the ridge were no longer distant specks. They had resolved into the hard, purposeful shapes of hunters closing in on their prey. Foreman Harris, flanked by 2 of his cruelest men, was coming for them, and the land itself seemed to offer no mercy, no shadow, no place to hide. Panic was a wild, frantic bird beating its wings against Shan Lin's ribs. Her every instinct screamed to run faster, but her legs were leaden, her lungs on fire. Wei stumbled beside her, his small face a mask of pale terror, his breath coming in ragged sobs. Ethan, the telegraph boy, was no better. His city shoes were in tatters, his breathing a harsh, ragged saw in the otherwise silent air. He was a boy of wires and words, not of rock and relentless sun. They could not outrun the horses. The knowledge was a cold, hard stone in Shan Lin's gut. To keep running on this open plain was simply to choose the place of their execution. Her eyes, trained by a lifetime of observing the subtle language of the earth, scanned the horizon, searching for a break in the endless rolling expanse. And then she saw it, a dark, jagged line etched into the landscape a half-mile ahead. A ravine. A dry, forgotten riverbed carved deep into the prairie. It was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. But it was their only chance. There she gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. We go there." Now her voice sharp with a new and desperate authority spurred them on. They ran fueled by the last dregs of their adrenaline, the thunder of hoofbeats growing ever closer behind them. They scrambled over the edge of the ravine just as the riders crested the last hill, tumbling down the steep shale-covered slope in a shower of dust and loose rock. They landed at the bottom, bruised and breathless in a narrow, shadowed world. The walls of the arroyo rose 20 feet on either side, steep and impassable. The floor was sand and sun-bleached stone. They had found shelter from view, but they had also found their own grave. "We're trapped." Ethan panted his back against the rock wall, his face ashen. "They'll stand up there and just pick us off." "No," Shan Lin said, her mind racing, a strange, cold calm descending over her panic. She looked at the arrogant set of the foreman's shoulders as he dismounted at the ravine's edge above them. She knew this man. His cruelty was matched only by his pride. "He will not shoot us from up there. That is too easy, too clean. He will want to come down here himself. He will want to look me in the eye." She looked up at the loose fractured rock of the ravine wall above them. An idea born of desperation and a deep understanding of the land began to form. It was a terrible, fragile chance. "Help me," she commanded, her voice low and firm. "We will not be sheep waiting for the slaughter. We will build our own trap." For the next hour they worked with a frantic, silent energy. Under Shan Lin's direction, they found a section of the ravine wall that was deeply undercut and perilously unstable. They began to pile rocks not at the bottom but near the top edge of the slope, creating a deadfall, a small man-made avalanche held in place by a few key, precariously balanced stones. Wei, his terror momentarily forgotten in the face of a task, helped by gathering smaller stones, his small hands working alongside theirs. They were a family of ghosts building their own tombstone, hoping to drop it on their executioners. The sun was a merciless hammer. Their hands were raw and bleeding. But as they worked, a new feeling began to displace the fear. It was the iron-hard feeling of defiance, a shared silent vow that they would not die cowering. Finally, it was done. A ton of rock and shale now sat poised above the narrow path leading into their hiding spot, a silent, patient beast of gravity. They huddled in a small crevice on the opposite wall and waited. The waiting was a new kind of torture. The silence was broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the distant mocking call of a hawk circling in the brilliant empty sky. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel. Foreman Harris and one of his men were coming down. "You check that end," Harris's voice echoed in the narrow space. "They can't have gone far. I'll handle the apothecary myself." He appeared around a bend in the ravine, his large frame blocking out the light. He held a pistol loosely in his hand, a smug, triumphant sneer on his face. He saw them, then huddled and waiting, and his sneer widened. "Nowhere left to run," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "A lot of trouble for a simple runaway. Give me the boy, and give the telegraph boy that piece of paper I know he has. You do that, and maybe I'll make your end a quick one." Shan Lin rose slowly to her feet, placing herself in front of Wei. She met the foreman's gaze, and the fear inside her was burned away by a pure, white-hot rage. "You poisoned them," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of truth against the stone walls. "Men who trusted you. You let them die for a few extra dollars in your pocket." Harris's face darkened. The game was over. They were just Chinamen, he spat. "Now I'm done talking." He lunged forward, his hand reaching for her. It was the moment. "Ethan, now," Shan Lin screamed. From his hiding place further down the ravine, Ethan put his shoulder to the largest of the precariously balanced stones. It teetered for a heart-stopping second, and then it gave way. The world dissolved into a deafening roar of grinding, shattering rock. The deadfall they had built collapsed, a river of stone and dust thundering down the slope. Harris, caught by surprise, was knocked from his feet, his pistol flying from his grasp as a wave of shale and gravel slammed into him. The other outlaw let out a yell of alarm and was buried to his knees, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. But the trap was not enough to kill. It was only enough to create chaos. Through the thick, choking cloud of dust, Harris rose, roaring in rage, his face a mask of fury. He scrambled for his gun. Shan Lin did not hesitate. She grabbed the small pouch of hot pepper and dried herbs she had saved from her supplies, a simple cooking spice that was now her only weapon. As he fumbled for the pistol, she threw the contents of the pouch directly into his face. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as the fine burning powder hit his eyes. He clawed at his face, temporarily blinded, stumbling wildly. At the same time, Ethan, his face set with a grim, terrified determination, charged the other trapped outlaw, tackling him hard against the rock wall. The man's head struck the stone with a sickening crack, and he slumped to the ground unconscious. Harris was still screaming, firing his pistol blindly into the dust-filled air, the bullets ricocheting wildly off the canyon walls. Shan Lin grabbed Wei, pulling him deeper into the crevice, shielding him with her body, as the world echoed with gunfire and the enraged cries of the blinded Foreman. Then silence. The gunshots stopped. The screaming subsided into agonized moans. Slowly, the dust began to settle, revealing the aftermath of their desperate gambit. The second outlaw lay still, and Foreman Harris was on his knees, temporarily blind, disarmed, and defeated. They had won. In the ringing quiet, Shan Lin looked at Ethan, at her brother, at the man who had tormented them, now helpless at their feet. The chase was over, but as she looked up at the long, treacherous path leading out of the ravine, she knew their journey to justice had only just begun. The dust settled like a shroud in the quiet ravine, coating the living and the unconscious alike. The ringing in Shan Lin's ears subsided, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breath and the soft whimpering of her brother. The fight was over. The violence had passed, leaving a strange, hollow peace in its wake. She went to Wei first, her hands checking him for any injury, her voice a low, soothing murmur in their native tongue. He was unharmed, only terrified. Then she and Ethan moved with a grim, shared purpose. They took the ropes from the outlaws' saddles and bound Foreman Harris securely, his groans of pain earning no sympathy from them. He was no longer a monster of authority. He was just a man bleeding in the dirt. The power had shifted. Ethan stood over him, clutching the crumpled precious telegram. "We have him," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "We have the proof. We can take him to the marshal in Green River." Shan Lin looked at the steep path leading out of the canyon. She looked at Wei's small, exhausted face. The journey to Green River was long and dangerous. They might not make it. There had to be another way. A faster way. A justice as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. She knelt before the bound Foreman, her shadow falling over him. "You will write a confession, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice as cold and smooth as a river stone. He spat a glob of bloody dust near her feet. "Go to hell, apothecary." She did not flinch. She simply drew the outlaw's heavy knife from its sheath. "You will write down the names of the men who died from your medicine," she continued, her voice level. "You will write down the money you were paid by the railroad to let them die. You will sign your name to it." Or what he snarled, "You'll kill me. You don't have it in you." Shan Lin leaned closer, the tip of the blade tracing a line in the dirt beside his face. "One way or another, your story will be told." She whispered, her voice devoid of all heat, all emotion. "You can choose if it is written in ink on this paper." She nodded to the telegram in Ethan's hand, "or if I carve it into your skin for the vultures to read." Harris stared into her eyes, searching for the frightened girl he had tormented. She was gone. In her place was a woman made of iron and grief, and he finally truly broke. They left him there tied and defeated a scrawled signed confession pinned to his chest with the tip of her knife. They took the outlaws' horses, their guns, and their water. As the sun began to rise, the three of them, the healer, the messenger, and the child, climbed out of the ravine. They were bruised, exhausted, and a long way from anything that felt like home. But for the first time, they were not running. They were not hiding. They walked into the morning light, their faces set toward the future, leaving the monster to face justice in the grave he had dug for them. That haunting finale, Shan Lin's hand trembling as the vial of poison hovered between her oath and her conscience echoes, long after the credits roll. What would you risk to honor your promise even if it meant betraying everything you believed in? If Shan Lin's sacrifice moved you, tap like and leave a comment below. Tell me which side of that moral crossroad you'd stand on. Up next, witness the untold journey of Elias, the brave Apache scout betrayed by the army, and Beatrice Rowe, the woman lawyer who dared to stand by him in a world built on prejudice. Don't miss it. Subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be the first to see justice ride into view.